read a lot of fantasy and it's fairly varied. Some new stuff, some old stuff, but there are certainly some aspects I'd love to see more of in the genre. So here are 10 things I'd love to see more in fantasy books. Now, don't get me wrong, I love dragons, elves, orcs, and there are many different variants in the fantasy genre. There are tons of orc-like races in fantasy. However, one thing I'd really like to see is more unique creatures in fantasy. Something completely new and bizarre, or maybe taking inspiration from strange or rare animals that we have. It doesn't matter, just something completely different from what we're used to seeing. Even classes and types of species, there are certain things that are very common. You have the very elf-like races that are very smart, but also kind of pretentious and looked down, and a lot of them live in woodland kingdoms in forests and stuff. Give me a race of blob people that eat things that they roll over and they just get consumed inside them, and then they get bigger and bigger. Give me a smart, sentient race that are only this size. The 100% bonus points if the races or the species and the creatures are tied to the setting or tied to the lore of the world, or there's a reason for them to have evolved in this way. Like I said, I love the classics. I will always love some dragons and things like that in my fantasy books. However, sometimes it's nice just to have something completely new to learn about. In a similar vein, we have unique settings, but also unique biomes. So I've talked about before how a lot of fantasy books are set in sort of a European medieval setting, and we don't get a lot of more desert settings, or perhaps even less advanced than medieval times. We go right back to an earlier time where they didn't have even some of those very basic amenities. So that is one point. I would love to see more castles flying in the sky, societies stuck underground because the planet isn't uninhabitable and they have to cling close to lava for warmth. Very unique and interesting setting. That would be a really good setting for a book. But on top of that, I would love to see some authors try brand new and completely unique biomes. Instead of going straight forward for the forest or the desert or the city sort of medieval setup, I love to see something completely unique with the landscape. And this is probably one of the biggest points on this list because it's one that I find very hard to even point to one or two examples. I will say the closest that I can think of in recent memory is having Mushroom Blues, this cyberpunk setting but with this fungal overgrowth and this very mushroom but also city-based biome. Such a cool setup, and I cannot wait to read this because of that. However, I'd love to see places made completely out of crystals, or going back to the earlier example of the castle in the sky, perhaps clouds in this world are thicker and they can hold up weight of people, but it gives them kind of like a bouncy movement. Completely changes how society would function, how fight scenes would function. Just, there's so much that could be built off of a brand new biome or setting that I would just love to see more of in fantasy. We do quite often get the very samey setups. I'd love to see more environment changes in our fantasy. Not only because I think that would just be really cool and interesting to read about, but I do think again that this would make a massive change to how society, characters, and plots would go, and we just get a brand new interesting branch of storytelling because we are building it up from a very unique foundation. Next on up, we have genre blending. Now, do not take this as a very broad, oh, I want to see more horror with fantasy. What I mean by this is I want a blend of many different genres. It would be so interesting to have this sort of fantasy story that has horror elements, but perhaps it's also very funny, or there's a murder mystery with the horror and the fantasy. We do get this already in some cases, but I would just love to see more of it, this complete mesh of different genres, and really how interesting that could be by taking completely what would seem like very unrelated genres and making them work well together could just make for some really interesting stories. Give me a thriller courtroom drama for fantasy. Give me a cozy fantasy with horror elements. Give me a fantasy memoir this does exist already in some ways, but I'd love to see more in that style or off that style. Perhaps mix another genre in, a fantasy, memoir, fairy tale. Don't question it, it could be really cool. We don't know. And kind of bouncing a bit off that point, but I'd love to see authors, and particularly publishers, because I do think this is more common in self-publishing, take more risks and add more weirdness. I want weird fantasy books, the type of fantasy book that you think, that doesn't make any sense. I want to read it and see what that's like because the synopsis is so ridiculous. This is how my obsession of Dungeon Crawler Carl started. I heard the synopsis of this guy who goes on an alien TV show, Hunger Games, with all of humanity, and he somehow has to survive making his way down into this dungeon. It sounds ridiculous. Did I mention he's also with a talking cat? That's awesome. It is so weird. I would love to see more authors really take these risks and get these very bizarre ideas. And Dungeon Crawler Carl is killing it. It was originally self-published and then it was picked up by a traditional publisher because it was so popular. And I think one of the reasons why it was so popular, there are many, because again, it's one of my favorite series of all time and I love it so much. But I do think one of the aspects it really helped with, not just marketing it, but also just the enjoyment, is how unique it is. It's just so bizarre and out there. And yes, there are RPGs that are similar or have a certain mechanic that perhaps is very similar to Dungeon Crawler Carl, but no one does it quite like Dungeon Crawler Carl. So more bizarre ideas. Just get weird with it. Give me some weirdness. And whether that is the setting, the character, the plot, or perhaps the prose is very strange. Perhaps it's written in second person. Not a huge fan of second person, but again, these very strange structured books or prose books or weird setting books, they're more of a Marmite type book. There are readers who absolutely hate that book, but there are readers who absolutely love that type of book. And I think that's far more interesting than releasing a bog standard fantasy book and just having this very mediocre response. I would love to see more of these very strange ideas that just completely immerse some readers and just perfectly works for them. And even if it doesn't work for everybody, I just think overall it's just a much more interesting book because of it. Now, this next one isn't going to work for every book, and I do think this will be harder for self-published authors, and traditional publishers are very wary of doing this because it is a lot of money. However, I would love to see more interior art in just standard copies of books, especially hardcovers where the fans normally pick those up first and they're a wee bit more expensive. It'd be great to see some of these characters or scenes visualized in art. Now, I know more cost, more expensive. I can see why not every book does it, and I do think not every book needs it, but just because it doesn't need it doesn't mean it wouldn't be better with it. Because I really do like, especially Empire of the Vampire, that was one of the first books I really noticed having a substantial amount of interior art inside the standard copy of the book. This is just the normal, regular UK hardcover. And to have as much art as this book does is absolutely insane. So it doesn't even need to be this much. 1 or 2 pieces would be awesome. Next on up is stories in the same world. I absolutely love when there are multiple series in the same world and maybe they're connected in some way, maybe by characters that show up in the next series, or time passes and it's their children, or perhaps there's hundreds of years of a difference and you can kind of see some of the foundations of a culture being made in one and how that affects the others, or how certain magic systems or cultures or traditions in this world change over time. This does happen. One of the biggest series that does this is probably Mistborn, with the first Mistborn trilogy going into Era 2, which is right here as well. And more recently, Richard Swan did this with his Justice of Kings series, Empire of the Wolf, and also the new Grave Empire book takes place in the same world, massive time skip, and just getting to see how the world changes over time is such a fascinating concept for me. But equally, I do love when it's within the same time and we're just following perhaps side characters and their life or other parts of the world that perhaps we don't explore in one series. Again, this isn't an every series should do this, because there are certain stories that are just better not knowing some of the mystery outside of the main narrative, not knowing and creating these stories in your head, or trying to figure it out over years by reading some of the subcontext in a book or in a series and piecing things together about what happened in the past or what you think is going to happen with these characters in the future. That's super fun as well. So again, this isn't every series, but I do love connected universes. And this takes us really neatly into the next point. It's as if I wrote notes for this video instead of just winging it on the day. Good job, Past Andrew. Novellas. Novellas and even short stories have become more popular with indie publishing and self-publishing. Here's my book, Silence of Silver. Just being able to explore some of these side characters or elements that don't necessarily fit into the main series but are really interesting and some readers might want to know more about. Novellas work so well in fleshing out a world or side characters, or even just attempting a very unique and interesting idea that wouldn't necessarily fit into a full-length novel. And I love reading novellas. I think they're really good palate cleansers between bigger books as well. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I think sometimes palate cleansers can sound a bit like, oh yeah, I'm just reading it between the main books that I like. No, I genuinely love reading novellas. Like Murderbot Diaries, one of my favorite series of all time. And I'd love to see, especially traditional publishing more novellas and short stories. I don't think they get the same amount of sales. In fact, I know they don't get the same amount of sales, which is really sad. And I can see why that makes them more averse to publishing it, because why spend the time on the editing, the cover, the marketing, and everything involved if you know it's going to get less sales just because it is a novella. However, that's one of the upsides to having things like ebooks. Even if it is ebook only, I think that I like novellas. We need more novellas. And if you too like novellas, you can read Silence of Silver completely for free by signing up to my mailing list. Link in the description. Damn sellout, these booktubers, man. Next on up, I would love to see more lesser mythological creatures being used in fantasy. Again, we get a lot of the classics, and I love the classics, but I would love to see more unique species and races. However, even delving back and trying some more unused mythological creatures could be really, really fun. I don't really have much in the way of examples for this one. Phoenix. Not really seen a Phoenix in fantasy, and that would be sick. I would love to see a Phoenix fantasy book. I have mentioned that one in the past now. I may one day write that book because a Phoenix would be awesome. But also, even with Scottish culture, I am Scottish, I would love to see, we were talking earlier about small people. There are these mythological creatures called brownies, and it's this fat little elf-like thing that kind of waddles about and they come in people's homes and steal things. I'd love to see things like that, just delving a wee bit deeper into some of the more unused and unique mythological creatures. I do think the Japanese has some really, really horrific, creepy mythological creatures. So if you're working on a fantasy horror book, highly recommend checking out some of their mythological creatures because they're terrifying. They're absolutely terrifying. Kind of going off that idea as well, I would love to see more inspiration even from a character and plot standpoint from lesser used cultures and traditions. And I do have an example for this one. We have Sons of Darkness by Gaurav Mohanty, which is an Indian-inspired grimdark fantasy series. And one of the huge draws for me to this series is that it takes inspiration from Indian mythology, especially one specific myth. So even from a plot and character standpoint, this is going to have elements of that myth within the book, which is just fascinating because it will make for a very unique story, because I don't know the original Indian mythological story. So having that as a basis for a fantasy book is just going to create a brand new and very unique narrative for me. Equally, of course, people who do know it will be able to see that in the narrative and that will be exciting for them. But even for people who don't know these cultures or traditions or mythological stories, are going to be able to go into something completely new and learn about a new culture. So again, that was a huge draw for me for Sons of Darkness. But of course, not just Indian mythology, but mythology and cultures from across the world, traditions. It doesn't matter what you're pulling on. If you're just pulling on a certain element from a different culture, or your culture, of course, and weaving that into the narrative, I would just love to see more of that, because we get a lot of standard European medieval elements to stories. And of course, you do get a lot of Greek and Roman mythology in fantasy. But I would love to see just more cultures. Would be really, really cool. And last but most certainly not least, this one is a much more superficial point on this list. I probably shouldn't have saved it for last and ended on something a little bit more profound. However, we're going very superficial for this last one, and that is more variation in fantasy cover art. Now, I have said in the past that I'm not a huge fan of more minimalist typography-based covers. However, they have grown on me. I do really like covers like Flames of Mira that we talked about earlier, or even something like The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. That is such a cool cover. I love it. However, it has become much more common now to have these very minimalist typography covers, and I'd love to see more than just special editions and indie leaning into these more illustration-based covers. I mean, if we go back to sort of the start of fantasy, the covers were so iconic, like Eye of the World, and even in slightly more modern day being a very broad spectrum in this case, we have like Michael Whelan's art with Way of Kings. Just Michael Whelan as a whole, all his work is amazing. They were iconic covers because they were so unique. And I know things change, time passes, we are going in this more minimalist direction, but I would love to see more of a mix of covers. Just sometimes getting a cover like this broken binding edition of Gardens of the Moon. And we are super lucky because indie is really killing it in this area. For example, this beautiful edition of The Elements of Time by Sam Paisley. The art is by Jeff Brown, who's just amazing. And this is an absolutely stunning cover. This is the same artist that did The Silver Blood Promise, which was traditionally published, but it's just a lot more rare now than it was. And I'd love to see more of that variation with the covers. If you have any points you want to add to this list, please drop them down in the comments below. Or if you have a recommendation for one of these prompts and you know a very weird fantasy book or one that uses a lesser used tradition or mythology, please drop them in the comments below. I would love to hear about it. Because the TBR is doing fine. Really, it's all okay. I got plenty of time to read all these books. It's great. But thank you very much for watching. Outro. Are you dead? I know, I feel a heartbeat. We're okay. She's not dead. She could be though. Apart from the snoring.